So welcome everybody to the July Soils Knowledge Network of Knowledge webinar brought to you by the New South Wales DPI Soils Unit. This webinar series is part of a community of interest around soil, so look out for other products you've probably heard of, like All the Dirt, which you may like to subscribe to. If you're listening but you're not a subscriber, the link to subscribe to the webinar invitation is on the front slide there at the bottom, the one with the EE Pearl letters in it. Well, I'd really like to introduce Susan Orgel, who's presenting today's webinar, Increasing Soil Carbon by Managing Soil Nutrition. Susan has worked for New South Wales DPI since 2005 on a range of soil health projects. But since 2012, she's worked as a researcher with the Soils Unit with the current focus on management strategies to increase soil carbon. Susan is interested in carbon fractionation, subsoil carbon sequestration, and the management of pastures to increase soil organic matter. And it's my pleasure to give Susan the presenter's rights. So over to you, Suze.
Thank you, Luke. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining in for this presentation on soil carbon. Soil carbon is a topic that has received, I guess, increasing attention over the last couple of decades, particularly with the role of soil for mitigating climate change through increased carbon sequestration. However, farmers have recognised the importance of increasing carbon in soil for production for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So it's something that I guess it's important for policy, but it's certainly important for production ability as well. Today I'd like to run through these 6 key points. First of all, what do we actually talk about when we say soil organic carbon? So what is it? Secondly, the importance of soil organic carbon for production, and I guess underlying that is farmers' income, so the support in terms of production and farming resilience and sustainability. Thirdly, the management practices to increase carbon, so what can we actually do to get more carbon in the soil, and in particular soil nutrition for production and therefore organic matter supply. Then how do we keep carbon in the soil? So once we actually get carbon into the soil, how do we actually stabilise that carbon so it stays there for longer? And I'll also run through some calculations for soil organic carbon stocks as well, so how we actually measure it. So to begin with, what do we actually mean when we say soil organic matter and soil organic carbon? These two terms often get used interchangeably. So carbon is what we actually measure, and that's the carbon component of organic matter in soil, and it's approximately, say, 58% carbon by weight. So what's the rest made up of? Well, it's pretty much what every plant's made up of as well. So the rest is made up of oxygen, so it ranges from about 10 to 40%. Hydrogen, so oxygen and hydrogen come from water and also from the atmosphere as well. There's nitrogen, so about 8 to 10% of soil organic matter is made up of nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, and then a range of other nutrients and trace elements in minor amounts. So obviously, while carbon's really important, we need to think about soil organic matter in terms of the other nutrients as well. When we actually look at what it is in the soil, it's been categorised into a range of different pools. So when we talk about organic matter in soil, by definition in Australia, it's the less than 2 millimetre organic fraction of soil. Now, it consists of partly decomposed organic residues, microbes, both alive and dead, humus, which I'll talk about later, and also charcoal as well. On the right-hand side of your screen, you can see what those fractions actually look like. So the particulate organic carbons is the small fractions of organic matter in soil. Humus is the sticky glue that you can see in the middle image. And on the right-hand side, you can see resistant organic matter or charcoal, so very fine bits of charcoal. And in some Australian soils, it's been reported to up to 35% of the soil organic matter actually consists of charcoal. Excuse me. So we need to think about soil organic matter in terms of productivity as well. And productivity is actually linked to soil functions that depend on the decomposition of organic matter. So while we want to increase carbon in soil, it's also important to think about we want to be increasing the cycling of organic matter through soil as well. So it's a very important nutrient reservoir. Up to 95% of soil nitrogen is kept in the organic matter pool. Up to 40% of the available phosphorus is in that organic matter pool. We know that with farming, a lot of our dollars is actually spent on phosphorus and nitrogen. And up to 95% of soil sulfur is also in organic matter. So it's important to think about the role of organic matter for supplying nutrients. Now, my example there where I say pasture phases and cropping phases is about the role of pastures in increasing organic matter and also available nutrients. So normally I'd be presenting to people where I could see them and do a demonstration on the board. But if we think about the pasture phase being 3 years and a cropping phase being 3 years, then going back into a pasture. During that 3 years of pasture phase, I want you to imagine that on the x-axis we've got time, on the y-axis we've got carbon. So as the pasture establishes, we get an increase in carbon over time. So we see that curve going up. Then we return to the cropping phase. If we don't apply mineral nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur, but the key is nitrogen here, when we return to that cropping phase, that carbon level will actually decline over the next 3 years. And our trials have supported this regardless of pasture type. If we don't apply fertilizer, if we go from a pasture phase to a cropping phase, we get this kind of increase in carbon, then decrease. And then the role of the pasture phase again is to increase carbon, and then we'll get to the cropping phase and we decrease. So that's agronomically desirable because the role of organic matter in that system, apart from other benefits such as enhanced soil structure, is supplying nitrogen. Therefore, we're not applying mineral nitrogen to that cropping phase. But inherently, we're actually running carbon up and down. So if we wanted to maintain carbon in that system when we return to the cropping phase, our trials have shown that you need to actually apply mineral N. So the question then becomes, what's the purpose of the pasture phase? If we ignore the, benefits of carbon for climate change mitigation, if we're looking at reducing mineral N inputs in this system and reducing costs, then it's agronomically desirable to actually use that organic matter that's been stored during the pasture phase in the cropping phase. Okay, so I guess the point of this is that it's stored in a high state of flux, so it's turning over very rapidly. And mineral nutrients move between the organic matter store and the soil solution through microbial mobilization and immobilization, so mineralization as well, as production moves on. So in addition to nutrients, organic matter is also very important for soil structure and increasing cation exchange capacity. So firstly, increasing water holding capacity. In a water limited environment such as Australia, increasing water holding capacity is a really important function of soil organic carbon. So in a sand dominated soil, we know that 1% increase in soil organic carbon, so moving from 1% carbon to 2% carbon, represents about a third increase in water holding capacity. It's less important for a clay loam, but when we're looking at clay-rich soils, the increase in carbon is really important for the plant available water, so making water that's more available to plants. So this is represented in a couple of examples graphically on the right-hand side of your screen as well, where here on the x-axis we've got an increase in soil organic carbon for a sand-dominated soil and a silt loam soil, so two quite common, I guess, in New South Wales topsoil textures, and on the y-axis we've got soil water content. Now this bottom line that we can see here in both graphs is wilting point. The top line here is our field capacity, so where the soil can no longer hold any more water without deep drainage. And as we can see, if we increase soil organic carbon content in both these soils, we get a significant increase in the amount of plant available water, which is the difference between field capacity and wilting point. Also important, I guess, is the role of soil organic matter for increasing cation exchange capacity. So the soil's capacity to hold on to and exchange nutrients. In sand-dominated soils, organic matter accounts for most of the cation exchange capacity, and that's where that rule of thumb of 2% organic carbon in your soils has actually come from. So it's looking at, if you've got a very sandy soil, you need at least 2% organic matter to actually support production through that role of cation exchange. So when we say it ranges from 25 to 90% of the cation exchange capacity at the lower end of the scale, say 25%, most of the cation exchange capacity is actually supplied by the clays in the soil. And at the higher end, we've got it supplied by organic matter in sand-dominated soils. Now, this is also dependent on pH, because in really acidic soils, we have our humic and our fulvic acids not dissociating, so they're not in solution and able to hold on to these cations that you can see hanging around here. As we increase the soil pH, oops, sorry, I'm pointing to the wrong screen. As we increase the soil pH, the dissociation occurs, and therefore we've got a higher capacity to store and exchange nutrients. So the point of this as well is that we've got soils that vary in their capacity to accumulate and store carbon. So how do we actually achieve increases in soil carbon? Well, it's about the balance. So we need to increase the supply of organic matter. And the best thing about this is what we ultimately aim to achieve in production. So to grow more biomass. An alternative to this is to apply biomass that's grown elsewhere to the site. So in terms of compost, or biochar. So we need to supply more organic matter, but it's a balance because we've also got a loss of a carbon that's occurring as well. So we've got a loss of carbon through the decomposition of organic matter. So as soil organisms break down organic matter, they also respire just like we do. And so you've got a loss of carbon from the system. Carbon also moves around the landscape with soil erosion. And different soils have different capacity to store carbon. So if we look at the screen now, on the left-hand side, we've got a dark dermisol soil on the right, so a soil with enhanced soil structure throughout the soil profile. And we can see that this is ultimately got a higher clay content and a higher soil organic content compared with the candor soil on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, the soil's capacity to store carbon is firstly determined, I guess, by clay content, because clay has a higher surface area than the coarser fractions of soil, so it can actually hold on to and carbon through organomineral association, so basically organic carbon sticking to clay surfaces. And the ability of organic carbon to stick to clay surfaces depends on the type of clay as well, because they have different reactivity and different charge as well. So we've also got this inherent capacity that we can see. But ultimately what it's about within a soil type is managing the supply of organic matter and the loss of organic matter. So if we think about this in terms of the soil profile and the flux and flow of carbon around the landscape, now we have the carbon loss via soil erosion. So we've got that red arrow there in the top right-hand side. So if we that's a given. We don't know necessarily that that returns to the atmosphere under all conditions, but it's certainly a loss from the particular site. We've got carbon being sequestered in the soil through photosynthesis. So we've got this influx of carbon dioxide through the process of photosynthesis into the soil. Once it's within the plant, it goes from the gas to a liquid in a plant and then into, I guess, a solid in terms of roots. So carbon gets into the soil through root exudates, root sloughing, and litter from above ground, and as well as dung as well. So we've got this above ground contributions, below ground contributions. Once it's in that organic matter pool and cycling around here, we have organic carbon that can be protected within aggregates. So it's basically protected from soil organisms and it's not readily accessible for decomposition. It can be chemically protected, so that's where we get these organomineral associations and organic carbon being bonded with clays. And then we have this accumulation of microbes. So dead microbes is a way of sequestering carbon, but live microbes also respire carbon. So this is where we get this soil respiration, and we also have plants respiring as well. So ultimately, we just want the photosynthesis carbon sequestration to be greater than the loss by soil and plant respiration. But as I said, we know that there's the influence of soil type and of carbon. So here on the x-axis, we have total carbon. It's in grams per 100 grams, so that's equivalent to carbon percentage. On the y-axis, we've got depth. So what I'm showing you now is to 70 centimetres, the carbon concentration on 3 different soil types in the Monero region of southern New South Wales. The first one is a basalt-derived soil. The second is a shallow granite-derived soil, so where the sea horizon or decomposing bedrock is within 50 centimetres of the soil surface. And the third one is the Monero deep granite-derived soil. So very productive as well. And as we can see, and as you'd expect, carbon is highest in the surface soil layers and then decreases with an increase in depth. We can also see a very obvious difference between a basalt-derived soil with a high and reactive clay content compared with a shallow soil and compared with the deep granite-derived soil, which is much sandier in those surface soil layers. Interestingly, for our native perennial pastures and our introduced perennial pastures, we can see little difference with perennial pasture type. So this data comes from 32 survey sites in the Monero region. Now we've also got an influence of climate as well. So what we can see now at the bottom of the screen is the soil carbon concentration throughout the profile for a deep granite-derived soil in the Burra region. So we've got the Monero region compared with the Burra region, and we can see that more than 30% more carbon was actually stored in the profile from the deep granite-derived soil in the Monero region, and that's due to a difference in climate. So in the Burra region, there's an equiseasonal rainfall distribution and milder temperatures compared within the Monero region, where you've got summer-dominant rainfall and much cooler winters. So we've got a capacity, I guess, to increase carbon storage, but also reduce the loss as well. So if we look at what this means in terms of carbon stocks, so the tonnes of carbon per hectare, these are the same sites. We've got our native and our introduced perennial pastures, and we can see there was no difference in carbon stocks to 70 centimetres within a soil type, but certainly differences within the region between soil types, so twice as much in those basalt-derived soils, and far less in the shallow granite-derived soil, where only native introduced pastures were considered. If we look at the Burra soils here, we can see that shouldn't say no significant difference. That should say a significant difference between the deep granite-derived soils in the Monero region and the deep granite-derived soils in the Burra region. But again, no difference between introduced and native perennial pastures down here. Now, the CG and RG here refer to it continuously grazed and rotationally grazed. And there was actually significantly more carbon under continuously grazed pastures in the Burra region compared with rotationally grazed when we look to 70 centimetres. And I guess this is contrary to some claims at the moment, or that have been around for a long time, about the role of rotational grazing on increasing soil carbon. But I'd like to point out here that this is actually confounded by soil nutrition. So our rotationally grazed pastures in the Burra region were low input pastures. So therefore, they didn't actually have fertiliser as part of their management strategy, whereas our continuously grazed pastures were fertilised. And it was the role of fertiliser in these systems that was actually increasing carbon. So now we've got a table that looks at the land management options to increase soil organic carbon. So we've got on the first line, we've got within Australia, looking at all the published data, we've got sequestration rates reported of up to 0.75 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year to 30 centimetres. So these are from replicated trials, not necessarily field surveys, but replicated trials which have demonstrated increases in soil carbon. If we look at what the majority of those increases in soil carbon are associated with, they're with the management of either soil nutrition or with pastures. So we've got perennial annual pastures in New South Wales sequestering up to half a tonne of carbon per hectare per year to 30 centimetres. Also the liming of pastures, pasture phases in cropping rotations, nutrient management, grazing management, and legumes in pastures, so supplying nitrogen in pastures as well. The highest rates reported are for legumes in pastures and converting cultivated crops to pastures. So where you're starting from a very low carbon concentration and then establishing a fertilised perennial pasture to increase carbon. But if we have a look at some of these rates, some of them are quite slow and unspectacular. And that's what we see in some of our replicated trials. So this is the master trial, which ran for 18 years in New South Wales at a place called Book. Now the soil type was a soda soil, so it was an acidic soda soil, so it had acid soil problems and it was also dispersive at depth. Now we're looking at 18 years worth of data. It was a continuously cropped paddock, and There was treatments of lime and no lime, and also annual and perennial pastures. The annual pastures were subclover and annual ryegrass. The perennial pasture was a mixture of phalaris, cocksfoot, with also an annual component of subclover. On the x-axis here, we've got the organic carbon concentration going up to 3.5%. On the y-axis, we've got depth descending to 1.2 metres. We've got our T0, so the start of the trial marked, and after 18 years worth of data marked here as well. So the circles are T0, the squares are after 18 years. Annual pastures are the solid symbols, and perennial pastures are the open symbols. And we can see after 18 years, we were only moving from an organic carbon concentration of 2 to less than 3, so less than a 1% increase. So it was quite slow and unspectacular in that sense, but there certainly was an increase. Interestingly, though, there was no difference between annual and perennial pastures, as both were fertilised and both were limed. So it was the role of the pasture in this system, not necessarily the type of pasture in this study, that was shown to be significantly different. And the sequestration rates are up to half a tonne of carbon per hectare per year. So the question then becomes, in some systems, why don't we see an increase in soil carbon despite best management? And farmers often ask me, I guess, the opposite. So it's always the neighbour doing the wrong thing, so cultivating quite aggressively, for example, overgrazing. Why don't they continually see a decrease in organic carbon concentration? Well, there's a few reasons for these. First of all, we could be looking at soil type and climate. So these are our major drivers of net primary productivity and decomposition. And if that's overriding any influence of management, then we won't see an increase or a decrease in carbon. Secondly, it could be that it's not necessarily the land use, that is crop versus pasture, but it could be more the management of that crop and pasture, and in particular ensuring that there's adequate nutrition of the crop or pasture to grow maximum amount of biomass. For the third point, for the water limit environment that plant exists in. So where we've seen no difference between annual and perennial pastures, what that research actually showed was that both plants were given ample opportunity to grow to their maximum amount for that given water limit within that region. Secondly, the other important thing was in that particular trial, they demonstrated that while, I guess, seasonally the contributions of organic matter were different between annual and perennial pastures, on an annual basis there was very similar contributions of organic matter to soil. So annuals dumped it all at certain times in the year, whereas perennials slowly distributed it throughout the year. In pastures also, we've got a very large background level of carbon, which means that detecting change might be challenging because you require a bigger amount of change because of the amount of carbon that's stored there, and also, I guess, similarly with the spatial variability of carbon within a paddock. And in some cases, perhaps soil organic carbon is just the wrong metric for the benefits of the management that you want to look at. A classic example of this, perhaps, is when we've started to look to 30 centimetres and we're comparing conservation agriculture with conventional cultivation, where you've got two different systems. So we've got minimum tillage or no tillage, which has very important benefits for soil structure and reducing soil erosion and increasing soil water, but we're not always seeing increases in soil carbon when compared with continuously cropped paddocks. And what we have is a redistribution of carbon throughout the profile. And so it's not saying that one is necessarily better or worse than the other, but soil organic carbon is perhaps not the right metric in that case. And in some cases, maybe we just need to add water. Left-hand side of the screen now, you can see one of the granite-derived sites from the Monero region, which was sampled in 2009. Now, this particular site was an introduced perennial pasture. This is a year before the drought broke, the millennium drought, and there was 40 tonnes of carbon per hectare in 30 centimetres. When we came back to this same site, so this arrow indicates the same point in the next photo, in 2012, this is what the site looked like. Now, there'd been no additional inputs to this site other than the drought breaking. It's the same site. And we saw 47 tonnes of carbon per hectare at this site here. So that was an increase of almost 2.5 tonnes per hectare per year to 30 centimetres, which is considerable when we think about the most we were achieving in our replicated trials is about 0.7. So we've got this huge influence of climate. Another example for a basalt-derived soil, 2009, it had 104 tonnes of carbon per hectare. You can see that considerable influence of soil type there for the same region. Coming back to the same, this is what I thought all sites looked like in the Monero because it's the first time I'd worked in this region. This is what I saw when I came back in 2012, and it had 131 tonnes of carbon per hectare. Now this kind of is off the record because we've got more or almost 9 tonnes of carbon per hectare per year being sequestered between these two sampling points, and it was a huge amount of particulate organic carbon that had been accumulated in that soil, so from fresh organic matter. If you can increase it that quickly, you can certainly decrease it that quickly as well, if not faster. So the way we measure carbon stocks is we obviously collect multiple samples to at least 30 centimetres. We calculate the soil bulk density, so we know the mass of soil per hectare. We measure the carbon concentration. And then very simply, it can get a bit more complicated when you're comparing between sites and over time. We multiply the carbon concentration by the bulk density, by the depth of the sample, and we make sure that we're just looking at soil, so we're not looking at the gravel proportion. And that will give us the tonnes of carbon per hectare. So if we just do a back of an envelope calculation for how it would increase from 2 to 3% carbon in the top 10 centimetres. As I said, it's back of the envelope. So I literally wrote on the back of the envelope because it's a bit rough. If we assume a bulk density of 1.2, so remember we're looking at the previous equation, and we're looking for a 1% increase in carbon over 10 centimetres. So it's the 1% increase multiplied by the 1.2 for bulk density, multiply 10 because that was the depth we were looking at. Well, that's an extra 12 tonnes of carbon per hectare added to the soil. All right. So if we think that plant residues contain about 45% carbon, so that means for that top 10 centimetres, we need to add 25 tonnes of dry matter per hectare to achieve that increase. If we were going to achieve that over 5 years, it would be roughly about 5 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year extra, so above what's being produced at that site now. But we know that about 50% of the added residues decompose very rapidly and don't move into that organic carbon, long-term organic carbon pool. So therefore we need to double it. So what we're looking at is over 10 tonnes of dry matter per hectare per year above what is currently added to get just a 1% increase in carbon. So it can be very slow, and I guess this is where soil nutrition can certainly play a role in increasing biomass production, but this is also where some claims of extraordinary increases in carbon just almost can't be true. So if we think about grazing management to increase soil carbon, this was a replicated grazing trial in the Monero region where 3 grazing over 5 years. The site was fertilised with phosphorus and sulfur so that the critical plant available nutrients were achieved. We've got ungrazed pastures, tactically grazed pastures, and cell grazed pastures. So we're looking at the influence of grazing management over 5 years. This is at the end of the 5-year trial on total carbon, nitrogen, and labile carbon, so fresh organic carbon stocks. Now we've got the ungrazed pastures, we can see, were significantly different to cell grazing, but there was no difference between the ungrazed and tactical. So tactical was basically grazed to allow seed set, and the tactical and cell graze. So we can see that there's a very strong influence of grazing management compared with if we just lock the pastures up on carbon stocks, and this happened just over 5 years. And this was a replicated trial, but there was no difference between cell and tactical graze. So this difference was not significant. So okay, well, what does that tell us? Tells us that we can manipulate plants through grazing management to achieve significant increases in soil carbon. There was no difference at the end of the trial in total nitrogen, but we know that throughout the trial this would have varied. So we've got this strong influence of soil nutrition on organic carbon. This graph has been presented in many different forms for a long time. So we've on the x-axis got nitrogen, on the y-axis got carbon concentration. We can see that there's a correlation between an increase in total nitrogen and an increase in carbon. So that's well known. We also know that there's an increase in phosphorus, coal phosphorus, and total carbon, and this is a positive and significant correlation as well, similarly with available sulfur. So therefore we could say, well, if we can increase available phosphorus and sulfur, we can A, grow more and maybe stabilise more, which we'll have a look at in a minute. So pasture management that's increasing herbage mass production is pretty much going to increase or give the soil the best chance of increasing carbon accumulation as well. Our grass-dominated pastures rely on nitrogen, so we need to make sure that legumes have adequate phosphorus and sulfur for nodulation so that we actually get this biologically fixed nitrogen as well. We know that legumes are sensitive to pH, but we also know that the rhizobia species are also sensitive to pH as well. So we need healthy legumes for livestock production, but if we want to have healthy nitrogen fixation occurring, so our legumes working harder, we need to make sure that pH actually is adequate for the rhizobia species. So here's our clovers here, which is looking at most of our subclovers. So they need a pH of above 5.5 to actually be actively fixing nitrogen. So this is a key in terms of liming, not necessarily for the pasture, but more for the nodulation and the associated rhizobian species. I also said that nutrients are important for carbon stabilization, and this is where I guess I'm going to start ending up the presentation on looking at the stabilization of organic carbon in soil. Clive Kirkby, a scientist from CSIRO, as well as other international scientists, have put a lot of research into looking at the relationship between nutrients and carbon. So if we look at the stable form of carbon, which in Australian soils is generally, in Australian agricultural soils, is generally about 70%, say humus, we know that for every tonne of carbon, there's 90 kilos of nitrogen associated with it, about 20 kilos of phosphorus and about 14 kilos of sulfur. So we know that stable carbon, which is actually microbial detritus, so humus is basically an accumulation of dead soil organisms and microbial products, actually needs nitrogen, phosphorus and sulfur as well, and this is the most stable form of organic carbon in soil. If we take a grass, for example, such as wheat, we know that a tonne of wheat has 17 kilos of of nitrogen, 2 of phosphorus, 3 of sulfur. So there's a significant gap here. So the nutrients are coming from somewhere. So we need to not only feed the crop or the grass, the pasture, we also need to, I guess, feed the soil organisms as well. And they're very effective at feeding themselves, but we can manipulate this process through soil nutrition as well. If we look at the nutrient concentrations between fungus and bacteria, we can see that humus is roughly in between, I guess, the concentrations in the soil organisms and the concentration that's actually in the grass. So this is where we know that these microbial products are significantly contributing to this humic pool, and this is where this theory of microbial detritus representing humus comes from. So nutrients are important. So what we can do, I guess, we've got trials starting in the field where we're looking at this recipe, and we've certainly got evidence from lab-based soil incubations as well, saying, okay, so if we look at this example now, there's 2 different soil types, basalt and granite derived. We've got topsoils, 0 to 10 centimetres, and subsoils, 40 to 50 centimetres, so looking at different soil depths, different microbial communities, as well as different clay contents, saying, if we increase carbon, which is the carbon added on the x-axis, and we use these ratios here for carbon stabilization, so basically a recipe saying we've got this much carbon going in, this much nitrogen and this much sulfur, can we get a linear increase in soil carbon, which is stable soil carbon, so it's going to be there for a long time, providing those really important roles for cation exchange capacity, plant available water, soil structure, and we can. It worked regardless of soil type, and it worked regardless of soil depth as well. This is in the lab, and now we're looking at taking this to the field to say, okay, could we actually look at enhancing the stability of carbon under pastures? But there's obviously going to be a cost associated with this, and I wanted to think about the potential value of this as well. If we were going to purely take this recipe approach in the field, there's going to be severe financial limitations, and I'm not at all suggesting this is what we'd do. But if we were going to put a value on those nutrients, if we've got a system without legume, which is the top part of this table, we're actually applying bagged nitrogen. These are the costs per unit, per kilo of this nitrogen added. It's going to be about $216 for 1 tonne of carbon increase. With a legume in the system, we can reduce that down to $81, but that's still a considerable cost. And so I'm not suggesting this is what we do, but taking the science, I guess, into how we'd actually of carbon in the soil and the associated benefits for production is certainly a way forward for pasture science. So, last slide. Can you trade carbon in soil in Australia? Well, yes, you can. So there's two methodologies that are currently approved by the Australian government and sit on the technical working group, which I guess assesses all the research around these methodologies and applications. So there's a measurement-based methodology, which is called sequestering carbon in soils in grazing systems. And this requires baseline measurements to be generated and then monitoring of these sites. So basically collecting baseline data, implementing a grazing management change. It can be fertilizer, it can be grazing management as well, just in grazing systems, and then looking at change over time, and you get paid on how much carbon you can increase. The second option, which just was approved last year, was the model-based methodology, and it's called estimating sequestration of carbon in soil using default values, so basically modelled values. So you can look up, saying, for a farmer in this region, looking at a management change of X to Y, what does the model tell you that you're going to actually increase carbon by? It might be 0.2. A lot of them seem to be 0.2 tonnes per hectare out of the model, and that particular amount would be how much you get credited for if you can prove that that's the management. So how do you prove that that's the management that you've adopted? Well, at the moment, you get a stat deck from an agronomist or a local advisor or some other approved person that says that you've adopted those management practices. No measurements required, and you just collect, I guess, some evidence that you've actually made that change. And those changes could be grazing management, they can be fertilizer, they can be liming, improved pastures, renovating pastures. So there's a lot of flexibility in that particular methodology. But I hope I've shown to you that our actual sequestration rates can be quite limited by some factors that are outside the control of management. So despite these policy tools, I guess, the limited studies that we've got report variable soil organic carbon increases, but there is that, I guess, opportunity to trade carbon in soil in Australia at the moment. So to finish off, the key messages I'd like to highlight is that both plants and soil microbes require nutrients, and this, I guess, is a key to increasing carbon in soils, and soil nutrition is important for plant production and also nitrogen fixation. So ultimately, my advice to farmers is always, no matter how you apply, I guess, nutrients in terms of if it's in an organic form or a mineral fertilizer form, as long as you're ensuring that plants have adequate nutrition to grow to their maximum water limited potential for that particular region, then you're pretty much ensuring that you've got a maximum supply of organic matter for that site. Optimizing nutrient management increases production and also organic matter stabilization, and we're I guess collating some evidence that strategic grazing increases organic matter supply, and it can certainly reduce the loss of organic matter through maintaining ground cover and reducing soil erosion. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Susan. No, thanks very much for that. That's certainly an extremely comprehensive cover-up of a fairly difficult topic. And you've made a lot of things that I knew take a lot of work to reach those conclusions and make them sound quite simple. So thanks very much for that. You've covered a lot in that time. So have we got any questions? I'll throw it open to the audience now. So I've actually got one for you, Suze, to start off with. You touched on a little bit on tillage. I'm just wondering whether you could expand on the role of strategic tillage in the field of soil carbon, whether there's more you can say.
Okay, thanks, Luke. So the question is about strategic tillage. So I guess in terms of carbon flux, the role of tillage can actually be an increase of carbon loss from the soil through enhanced decomposition. So basically, when the soil's cultivated, it alters the air and moisture in the soil and mixes up organic matter, so soil organisms actually become more active and respire more. So you think, okay, well, that's where we get this loss of carbon from the system, and continued cultivation can also enhance soil loss through soil erosion. The idea of strategic tillage is looking at, I guess, where tillage is going, the benefits of tillage are going to outweigh the loss of that short-term loss of carbon. So if it's going to, I guess, reduce perhaps a pest or a pathogen and ultimately increase biomass production and plant establishment then we could actually get an increase in carbon. So Mark Conya's trial, which on the GRDC strategic tillage project, has actually shown where you go in and actually strategically till a soil and then establish a pasture within 2 to 3 years, carbon levels actually go back to their original level of the permanent pasture. So we've actually not necessarily detrimentally decreased carbon in the soil, but we've perhaps in some cases even enhanced it if it means that you can get a better pasture established, a better crop established, and therefore, I guess, supply more biomass to that site. So while continuous aggressive cultivation is not necessarily recommended as a carbon management tool, obviously it wouldn't be, strategic tillage certainly offers opportunities to increase biomass and organic matter supply to soil.
Thanks, Suze. We've got a question from Carol Rose.
Just wondering what your take is on compost tea.
I think that anything that you could do to increase microbial activity in the soil could be beneficial for carbon sequestration. Compost teas, I haven't seen a considerable amount of published data on the benefits in terms of nutrient cycling and increases in soil carbon. The process, I think, theoretically, on a smaller scale, could increase microbial activity, but I haven't seen any convincing evidence in the published literature that it would change the microbial dynamics. And I know you know this, Carol, that we've got this huge abundance and diversity of organisms that are already in the soil. Introducing a small amount of specific organisms is unlikely to considerably alter that balance. What they are going to be changed by, I guess, is their environment, so habitat, air, moisture, shelter, and food being carbon. I think certainly, though, looking at microbes in terms of nutrient supply and decomposition is an expanding field that needs more attention.
Okay, thanks, Carol. We've got Lindsay Johnston with a question. I'll just ask Lindsay's question. It says, is there a rule of thumb ratio of nutrient levels required per unit of rainfall in different pasture systems to maximise growth? Do you want me to repeat the question?
I'd only say I want you to repeat it so I can think about it. That's a really, it's a very good question about a rule of thumb for increases in nutrients per millimetre of rainfall. It's certainly, we've got a project that's starting, and it's looking at, I guess, carbon sequestration across a climate gradient, or a proposal across a climate gradient looking at nutrient availability. So at the moment, I don't have that information at hand, but it's certainly an output that we hope to get from a current project. In terms of nutrients required for the humus, that's kind of universal. It doesn't matter on climate, doesn't matter on doesn't matter with soil type, it's just looking at those ratios that's actually in that humic pool. But your question is really important, because what it does is, I guess, it overlays that matrix of nutrients required for pasture growth, stability, and that role of nutrient cycling. And that role of nutrient cycling is going to be different under different pasture types and under different climate scenarios. So it's a really, it's an insightful question. Thank you, and I'm sorry I don't have a better answer.
Okay, we've got Jeremy Giddings.
On one of the earlier charts, you had a graph, one of the earlier slides, you had a graph of water holding capacity improvements. Were the units metres cubed of water per metre cubed of soil? Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. And I think these slides will be made available as well. So this is an older paper, and it's actually very challenging to find increases. Lots of people talk about increases in water holding capacity and plant available water with increases in carbon, and it's very hard to find published data actually on what those rule of thumbs are, but you're correct.
Right, thanks, Suze. Thanks, Jeremy. Now, I've also got from Carol, which is, do you see a risk in carbon trading for those years when cropping or drought decreases carbon in soil?
Very good question. Yes, I do. They put a buffer into your contract for climate and drought. So there's like a 20% kind of bank that they take for your carbon credits and park it somewhere saying, well, if there's this climate risk. Important things about carbon trading is that it's either a 25 or 100-year contract that you enter into, which is tied to the title of the property. Depending on which methodology you go with, you only get paid on the actual increases under the measurement-based one. Under the model-based one, you get paid, I guess, regardless, because there's no measurement associated with it, but those predictions might change. I think the benefits of increasing carbon outside of carbon trading far outweigh the risks that you take on with carbon trading in most of the agricultural systems. But the real opportunities are where carbon trading can incentivize land use change or better land use management. So where there is perhaps a degraded paddock, it can offer some incentive, financial incentive to perhaps plant a permanent perennial pasture and do it well in terms of establishment. But what you need to think about, and thinking about that table that I put up before with the sequestration values, is you need to account for additional emissions. So if you grow more pasture, you are likely to graze more livestock, and then therefore that additional amount of livestock that you graze, you need to account for those emissions in terms of how much carbon you've sequestered. So if you sequester 1, for example, but you emit 2, therefore you don't get any money because you've actually emitted more than you've sequestered. If you're not part of a trading agreement though, those emissions at the moment as it stands aren't taken into account. The same goes for if you apply fertiliser. So if you can increase your soil organic carbon, and even the model-based one will actually generate this for you. You can have a play with it on the internet, the tool that they've got there. If you increase soil carbon, but you increase your emissions because you're using a nitrogenous-based fertiliser, limes, because when you apply lime, the way that reacts in most soils produces carbon dioxide, so they account for all of that. So it makes the amount that you can actually increase even less. And remember, the last auction, I think carbon per tonne was about $12 a tonne. And it's a bid, yeah, cheapest price carbon.
Great, thanks, Suze. Thanks, Carol. I've got another question for you, and it's relating to the variation in carbon within the year and how big this could be and what the limitations are for the time of sampling. Is there a best time of year to sample?
Okay, so first of all, the variation within the year is very significant. Obviously, it depends on what system you're in, if you're in a cropping-based system or if you're under a perennial pasture or an annual pasture, and if you're cultivating or not, but there is more variation within the year generally than there is sequestered over the year. So it's very important to get the same time of year sampling or under the same conditions. And the classic example of this, I think, where we've had a scientific discussion about this is within the technical working group for soil carbon at that Australian government level, because they had set there that you had to sample within the same month when you go back and resample to show that you've either increased or decreased carbon. Now, we challenge this quite strongly because it's not necessarily about a month or necessarily a season, but it's about soil conditions. So roughly you could say, all right, if we're always going to sample before your maximum biomass production in perhaps April or spring or whatever system that you're actually working in, as long as the conditions are always the same when you go back to have your continual monitoring, then that's the most important thing. If you pick a time of the year where there's more fluctuations, so we're kind of mid-peak growth, then you might actually see more fluctuations in your results depending on when you sow or pasture biomass or crop curves.
Thank you. It's more of a comment, I think, from Douglas Fox. So Douglas has typed in, the largest failure in applying living entities to the soil is the failure to evaluate if there is a suitable tucker and accommodation to sustain them as a viable living entity.
I couldn't agree more. I think by the time you start tinkering with the actual organisms that are there, you've spent a long time making sure that everything else is right, and I don't think very many people are at that point.
Terrific. A wrap-up comment from Rebecca Lyons-Kelly. So Rebecca has said, Suze, congratulations on an excellent presentation. Your grasp of the topic is formidable, and your summary is succinct and informative, easy to follow and understand, and your future research looks fascinating. Thank you so much, Rebecca Lyons-Kelly. Thanks for that, Rebecca. Mightn't be a bad note on which to end. So thank you so much, Susan, for a really informative webinar. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Sue.